Okay, everyone, so as we discussed when we left off last time, what we want to deal with now is how to get larger quantities of data into our visualization, into the right format for our visualization, and into our visualization without spending tons of time retyping data or copying and pasting. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at one way, this is just one of many ways, but one way that we can get a subset of data into the format that we need for Google visualizations, which at the moment we're just working with a bar chart that has, that's measuring sort of one, that has sort of one measure, right? So one set of bars. So what I'm going to do is copy this data out of this current workbook, okay? So again, just copy that. I'm not going to create a new Excel workbook. And by the way, this would work basically the same way even if you don't have a license of Excel. So we can also look at this in something like LibreOffice, which is an open source, kind of like an open source version of Excel. It has a spreadsheet program. We could probably do something similar actually in Google Sheets, for example, but for speed, I'm going to work here locally. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste in the data that I'm looking for here, and I'm going to just pump up the font size here, so this is hopefully a little easier to see on your screen. So again, here's my data. So what is the format that I need to get it into? I need to make it into a list of lists. So my first concern is converting this data into, to making sure that I can make each row into its own 2-item list, and then I can worry about making it a larger list, which of course is not that complicated once I've done the individual lists. So what I'm going to use here is I'm going to use a function that exists in Excel. It actually exists in a lot of programming languages, although in a lot of programming languages also called concatenate. And concatenate is the term that we use when we think about basically adding strings together, right? So if I want to add, to quote unquote add or glue together two strings, the word that we use to describe that is concatenation. And it turns out that Excel actually implements this function called concatenate. And so what we need to do is, yes, I know it contains an error, according to you, Excel. What we do is we give it the things that we want to stick together. So remembering that the format of our list of lists, that each item in the list is surrounded by square brackets and has a comma, separating the two items. And then of course that while the first item is a string, thereby surrounded by single quotation marks or quotation marks, the second one is a number. So what I need to do is I'm going to manually insert this punctuation into the concatenate function, but then I can also reference specific parts of my existing data so that I actually get kind of a dynamic list generated. So it's probably easier if I just if you watch the demonstration. So the first thing that I need, of course, is a square bracket. Okay, because as we know, the very first character in any one of these lists is a square bracket. The next item, if you notice, is actually a quotation mark, a single quotation mark. So I'm also going to include that. And you'll notice that I have wrapped this whole thing in double quotes. So again, so in concatenate, you notice that the syntax, other than the equal sign, right? The syntax here is very similar to functions that we see in JavaScript. We have the name of the function, and then we have round parentheses. What goes in the parentheses? The ingredients for that function. What concatenate takes is a list of strings, and it will stick them all together. So the first string that we want to, and of course, because they're strings, we denote them with, we surround them by double quotation marks, right? So hopefully this is a little bit, this feels a little bit like related to the work that we've already done in JavaScript. Okay, so that's my first item, and then I have a comma. So you see it's also providing a little helper text for me here. So what's the next thing? Well, the next thing I want is the name of the country. That blue is the way that it's indicating it's a variable reference, right? So in Excel, it refers to cells by their column number, column letter, and row number, and that identifies a unique cell. It's like a variable name, so it quite literally, Excel is saying, next, put in the stuff that is in the box labeled A1. Okay. Next, we're going to need a comma because, of course, we want to separate. Whoops. Oh, I tried to tab there and that didn't work. Next, I'm going to need a comma, which again, I need a comma as a string, so I need to wrap it in quotation marks. Oh, and I also need to close that quotation mark around, around Afghanistan, right? So it's a little hard to see, but if I look at it like this, I can actually add spaces. It won't hurt it at all, right? What I'm seeing here is bracket quote, data, variable, whatever is in the box called A1, and then quote and comma. So the next item that I need to add is actually my count here. And then of course I need to also add my final square bracket. And because this smaller list is going to go into a larger list, I'm also going to add a comma to the end of that, right? Because if I look at my data points here, this is an individual item, and then there's a comma that goes at the end of it, and then the next item happens, right? So coming back to this, I think I should be all set. I'm going to hit enter. And as I look at this, now I can change this formula if I don't want to actually have these extra spaces in here. It's okay if it does. It's not going to hurt it any, right? But now this is starting to look actually pretty good. It looks like an item in a list of lists. So if you don't have a lot of experience, if you haven't worked with Excel previously, it might not be obvious that, again, this is a formula, okay? And by default, if I copy this formula down to the next row, it's going to also move the references down one row. So this is referring to, this is a formula that appears in row 1, and it refers to cells in row 1. If I copy the formula to row 2, it's going to adjust those formulas to refer to what's in row 2. This doesn't always have to be the case. There are ways around it, but that is the default behavior. So now what I can do is I can just paste this all the way down my data, right? And now I suddenly have, and you actually notice, interestingly, it has automatically interpreted these dashes as 0. Again, we would need to go back and check our data after doing this process and make sure that that's suitable. But you know, you can see now that we have a data set that's pretty much in the shape that we need it to be in. So what I'm going to do is copy this out, right? So again, I'm copying this. Before I put this into my, I could probably just put it directly into Aptana, right? See how that looks? And it looks pretty good. It's kind of awkward, kind of bulky, right? It makes it pretty confusing to look at all of my stuff here. So instead what I'm going to do is, well, so I am going to put it in there. I'm going to use it to replace this. Okay, so I'm going to do this. So remembering that this is the beginning of my list of lists, right? Here are my individual items. I don't need a comma on the last one, and then I need to also close that again and have a semicolon. And so if I do this and I do a quick format on it, you can see that it actually does go and wrap it all into a single line, which is more or less readable. I think it's kind of less readable, but we're going to deal with that in a moment. So again, here now, I have my list data. Obviously, I want to adjust my titles here. So I'm going to say country, and I'm going to say refugee count. It's going to change my titles. And if I come back here, let's see what happens. Okay, now we're starting to get something that looks a little bit more like data. So this is a great way to handle getting larger volumes of data into our data set. Obviously, if I wanted to edit this data, I could just delete certain rows. So I could have done this with the entire original data set. Yeah, I could have done this with the entire original data set, right? And then just removed rows that I wasn't interested in. And those of you who have experience with Excel, obviously there are a lot of tips and tricks. So please feel free to use those and also to share those with your classmates. This is just one example of dealing with this. So the other major drawback to this, though, is that now I have a situation where, again, all of my data is here and it's kind of stringing out to the right. It's not very easy for me to see what's going on. And so again, I would prefer not to have this directly, and again, just for sort of for like hygiene purposes, keeping the things that I want separate. I prefer not to have this directly in this file. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file, new JavaScript file, and this one is going to just be called data. Okay, so I'm just going to say data.js. Okay, and in data.js, all I'm going to do is paste my data items. Now, I gave these the same name originally. I'm going to change that. I'm going to make this, I have list data 2, so I need to make sure to pass this list data 2. And I'm going to go list data 1 and make sure I call this list data 1. Okay, now that I've done that, I can actually copy out, I'm going to remove this variable and put it straight in data.js. So again, the only thing in data.js are these two variables that have my data in them. It's data.js and, okay, yeah, and list data. Okay, right, and again, I can do a nice format on this. Still not super readable. I prefer it when it's vertical, but I could just paste it into Excel again if I wanted to do that, okay? So here are my two data objects. And now, let's see what happens. Oh, nothing. What went wrong? Well, I have a suspicion that I know what went wrong, but let's check it out. So if I go to the console, I see, list data 1 is not defined. Right. So remember that I removed list data 1 from my HTML and put it in data.js, but I never included data.js in this HTML file. So here's the neat thing. Even though this is in a completely separate file, as long as I include it above the JavaScript file, the JavaScript that needs to deal with it, it's as though it was in the same place, right? So again, this including the linking CSS and JavaScript is incredibly powerful thing to do because it lets me separate things into separate files to make them more readable. So now I'm going to choose data.js. But at the same time, the computer treats them as though they were all in the same file in the first place, right? So now if I reload, let's see how I do. Ta-da! So I would say that the last step for me to do here is to actually get all of this JavaScript out of this file. So I'm actually going to create, I'm going to go ahead and create a second scripts.js file. I'm going to call this, I'm going to create a new from template JavaScript, and I'm going to call this, oops, come on, I want to save it. Save as, yes. I'm going to call this, chart scripts. Okay. And into this, I am going to paste everything between these script tags, right? So I now have all of this stuff, right? I need to make sure I get all of my curly braces in there. Again, I'm going to go format. Format. That looks good. Okay. Now I have removed what was in here and put it into chart scripts. So instead of having it directly in here, I'm going to change this source to be chartscripts.js. And now I should again get exactly the same thing happening as I was previously, but yay! With all of my code, style, my JavaScript, so my interactivity, my data, my styles, and my structure are all in separate files. So this is really what we've been working towards. And what that means is that if something happens in one place, like, oh, I replaced my data, I introduced an error, well, I know if I only touched my data file that that's where the problem is. So this is a way to help kind of save ourselves accidentally introducing errors, or if we do, knowing where to find them. So when we come back, we're going to look at a little bit more styling with our Google visualizations.